Hello, I'm Lacy MacAuley in Washington, D.C., and I'm here to talk to you about the Panama Trade Promotion Agreement, or the Panama Free Trade Agreement, an agreement that isn't good for anyone. Congress should vote an emphatic no on this proposed plan. People and planet should come before profits, but the proposed Panama trade plan would mean greed rules. The Senate Finance Committee is meeting tomorrow, May 21st, 2009, to discuss this proposed Panama Trade Promotion Agreement. Top trade negotiator Ron Kirk is trying to ram through this agreement by July 1st, when the Panamanian head of state, Martin Torrijos, leaves office. But this is just another free trade agreement that is bad for the people of Panama, it's bad for the planet, and it's no good for the people of the U.S. We should call upon Congress to stop it now. There's a rancher that I know who raises cattle in the San Blas Mountains of Panama, who I'll only call Uncle Ricky. I met Uncle Ricky when I traveled to Panama in November of 2008, and I remember him for being a jolly fellow with a big belly who proudly bounced his new granddaughter, Antonia, his first grandchild, on his knee. If the Panama Agreement went forward, Uncle Ricky would have to contend with a host of difficulties. The first would be that U.S. cattle ranchers, who enjoy hundreds of millions in subsidies from the U.S. government, for example, U.S. livestock farmers got handouts of about $344 million in 2003, would suddenly be able to sell duty-free to Panamanians. At the same time, Uncle Ricky would have to compete with a dramatic influx of cheap pork products from the U.S. Pro-pork lobbyists think that the increased sales to Panama will result in $20.6 million in increased revenue. Uncle Ricky will have a lot of trouble making a profit by selling his beef to the Panamanian market, and eventually he may have to sell his land. Farmers should be allowed to sell to their local markets. Local, living economies are good for everyone. If officials pass this harmful agreement, farmers like Uncle Ricky will no longer be able to carry on farming. Who will be there to buy the land of farmers who are forced to sell? Companies from the U.S. and other rich nations, and maybe some wealthy Panamanians who support this agreement. This leads to a consolidation of power and decision-making, as fewer people own more and more of planet Earth. But people have a right to self-determination and autonomy, and the Panamanian government should respect that right. Another supporter of the Panama Agreement is Caterpillar Corporation, maker of heavy machinery used for logging and construction. They are frothing at the mouth, thinking of all the Panamanian trees they can cut down and the increased heavy machinery sales that will result. By the time the little Antonia is going on her first date, the forests of Panama will probably be decimated. The clean rivers and pristine stands of old-growth trees a distant memory. Verdant ecosystems will be forever ruined for incredible species like the blue morpho butterfly, which I first saw shining iridescently as it soared through the rainforest in the Boquete region of Panama. Like all of us, Antonia has a right to intact ecosystems, which Caterpillar seeks to undermine through the support of this agreement. Another group who will be thrown under the bus if the agreement passed would be the Kuna Indians, a Panamanian ethnic group who have preserved their cultural heritage. Traditional farmers and artisans, these indigenous peoples also face steep competition, and many may have to abandon the ecologically sustainable, culturally rich ways of life their ancestors have known for thousands of years. Will Antonia benefit, at least, from a more productive national economy? Probably not. Even looking at the brute economic indicator of gross domestic product, this trade agreement does not promise positive effects. A similar trade agreement offers foreshadowing of what could happen if the Panama Agreement goes through. NAFTA, a 1994 trade agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, has shown that increased unprotected trade with the U.S. is not likely to promote self-government, support local living economies, or benefit most people at all. GDP growth has been unequal after NAFTA, with Canada growing an average of 3.6% per year, the US growing 3.3%, and Mexico growing only 2.7%. The average Mexican did not benefit from this growth, as income inequality has risen. Wages of Mexican workers decreased by 18% in the first 5 years. The predominant occupation in Mexico prior to NAFTA was farming, but many farmers, mostly in central Mexico, were forced to sell or abandon their land after subsidized corn from the U.S. flooded into Mexican markets, leaving the Mexican farmer unable to compete. Corn is indigenous to Mexico and was farmed mostly sustainably. But now what is left is forced to compete in an atmosphere of industrial agriculture. After NAFTA, Mexico has maintained a trade deficit with the U.S., meaning they import more than they export. This leaves the country hemorrhaging money in exports, which isn't good for anyone in Mexico. Furthermore, trade agreements like this one are bad for U.S. workers, as we lose jobs here in the U.S. In just the first 7 years, NAFTA had caused the loss of 766 30 jobs in the U.S., and it will cost us U.S. tax dollars too. By 2002, the U.S. Department of Labor had qualified 408,000 workers extensions on their unemployment benefits because their jobs had moved to Mexico. Trade between the U.S. and Panama totaled $2.1 billion in 2002. U.S. exports account for about $1.8 billion of that amount. This means that for every $10 worth of goods that the U.S. sells to Panama, Panama sells only $1 worth of goods to the U.S. The exports Panama sells to the U.S. account for a tiny fraction, only 1.4% of its GDP, of $21 billion. Yet it is willing to sell its own people down the river for this pittance. The farmers who will be forced to sell their land and migrate in Panama may be forced to relocate to the city of Colón, where there are jobs in the Colón Free Trade Zone, or Zona Libre. When you picture a free trade zone, picture Pleasure Island from the Disney cartoon Pinocchio. For rich companies, a free trade zone represents a lawless area, free from tariffs, taxes, or pesky labor or environmental laws. It usually looks like a collection of warehouse-like buildings on the edge of a port city that is protected by barbed wire. Working people, such as ex-farmers, travel into these zones each morning to do the most tedious grunt labor in return for low wages. Corporations like the low wages, while the workers are usually just desperate for any work they can get. Ships pull up to the buildings, unload raw materials like t-shirt fabric or radio parts. Workers assemble them, and the finished goods get shipped to rich countries where people can afford them. In his 2008 State of the Union address, Bush asked Congress to approve the Panama Trade Agreement, gleefully stating that the agreement will support good jobs for the finest workers in the world, those whose products say "Made in the USA." That sentiment is perplexing to anyone familiar with Zona Libre, where low-paid workers work in unsafe work conditions to sew together textiles bound for the U.S., valued at $400 million per year for companies like Orotex, with offices in Farmington Hills, Michigan. Textiles and clothing account for about 24% of the work done in Zona Libre. This happens as U.S. workers lose more and more textiles jobs, yet purchase more and more clothing. For all of the celebrated freedom that free trade measures like the Colón Free Trade Zone has received, you would think that Panamanians would be better off. However, the average Panamanian is not better off. Income inequality has risen, placing Panama among some of the most unequal countries in Latin America. Panama's index for income inequality is 60, according to a World Bank report. As the report says, inequality is more obvious in urban areas like Colón, where the close physical juxtaposition of the modern dynamic wealthy sector with poor city slums accentuates the perceived gap between rich and poor. I have never seen Colón, since my Panamanian friends have insisted that if I were to travel there, I would become a certain victim of mugging or kidnapping. But the real Panamanian danger isn't really frustrated urban poor who see wealth all around them but can't touch it. The real danger is the Panama Trade Agreement. Some are arguing that this trade agreement is needed to rescue the U.S. economy, but Panama's entire economy is 0.15% the size of the U.S. economy. The U.S. has 100 times more people than Panama. That's right, I'm saying the country is tiny. For U.S. officials to undermine people's basic rights in order to do business with this small country in hopes that its tiny economy will deliver us from certain economic death is a mistake. If passed, this agreement will harm Panamanians like Uncle Ricky. It will negatively impact little Antonia and make her economic future less certain. It will not benefit the average Panamanian, but is likely to lead to a decrease in self-government and a spike in average income inequality, as NAFTA did. And it will not benefit the people of the U.S. Our Congress should vote an emphatic no on the Panama Free Trade Agreement. This has been Lacy MacAuley in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much.